Welcome everyone, and welcome to our thank you, Professor Terry Winograd, for his special lecture today for our class. This is the second time that he come back to my class. I would like to ask Professor Daniel to speak, to welcome everyone to this lecture.
Sure. So thank you very much all for attending this exciting guest lecture. My name is Daniel Emiot. I'm the director of the new online master's degree in digital transformation and innovation. And many of you are part of this program, or maybe to another newcomer, namely the master's in interdisciplinary AI program, which we launched a year ago. So I hence wish a very special welcome to the new students among you on behalf of the School of Engineering Design and Teaching Information at the Faculty of Engineering. And as you know, whether you're working in digital transformation or AI, there are increasingly many ethical concerns that must be taken into consideration these days. Our systems and processes are often socio-technical in nature, and this is, bringing interesting challenges during design decisions and operational decisions as well. And what is right or wrong has never been blurrier, especially with what's happening in the geopolitical area these days, and people are even polarized by those questions. So Professor Chanarong has taken the initiative of contacting experts in the field to help us understand some of these challenges and hopefully elements of solutions in that area. And I may be biased, but I think you're very lucky to have Chanarang as a professor for this course, and also Caitlin. Caitlin is here. Hi. Um, so Chanarang has helped redesign the course with Professor Jason Miller last year. And I'm pretty sure that he's eating ethics for a living because he published recently in that area as well. So Professor Terry Winograd is very famous. He's from Stanford University. His contributions range from language understanding and cognition to also human-computer interaction, and also the famous PageRank citation ranking algorithm used in Google's search engine. And also perhaps of closer relevance to the ethics course is Professor Winograd's founding of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law, and of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, CPSR. There is another professor from the University of Toronto, Hector Levesque, who even proposed a test of machine intelligence named after him, so the Winograd Schema Challenge, or WSC. So I'm afraid that Liam and I are not quite there in our careers. So we are privileged to be able to listen to his talk tonight, and I'm eager to acquire knowledge and wisdom from him. However, I would like to give the microphone and camera to Professor Payton as well, who happily retired as well. And I want to give him a chance to say a few words about Professor Winograd, who was his supervisor in another millennium, I'm afraid. Please, please also know that Professor Payton was very instrumental in the creation of the DTI programs, both online and in person, and is also a great guy and a great friend. Please note that I will have to escape a bit early because I have a concurrent PhD defense in South Korea that starts in 1 hour. So without any further delay, I wish you all a great evening and a great semester.
Thank you, Daniel. I just wanted to add a few personal words of thank you to Professor Winograd for being here, and just to highlight some things that you might not glean about Professor Winograd from a Google search. When I was a student of his at Stanford in the 1980s, one of the first things I learned from Terry that was a revelation to me, especially back then, was the importance of multidisciplinary, multi-perspective, international. The people that I saw immediately in his group came from all parts of the globe. He was working on a book with Fernando Flores, which most people might not have known at the time, that he was a member of Allende's cabinet in Chile before they got overthrown by the CIA. I was funded by a group called the Center for the Study of Language and Information, which had philosophers, linguists, computer scientists. And I also met a steady stream of students from Norway and Denmark through Kristen Nygaard. But the other thing I immediately learned from Terry was the importance of personal ethics. And it's his ethics are kind of personal statement of values that hopefully we share as humans. And it's about what it means to be human, even when you're doing something like computer science. But the final thing I learned from him, probably the most important thing, is great minds make time for meaningful people and insight, no matter how small the details. And in fact, that's how he arrived here. When Chanarong was finishing his PhD and had some funding from Facebook Research, he was going to Silicon Valley. And I said, well, I haven't talked to Terry in a very long time. Probably would have been decades at that point, but I found him on email and sent a little introduction. And he was willing to meet with Chanarong and stay in touch with him over the years. And I really appreciate that. And I've sent other groups down to Terry. So Terry, thank you very much for who you are, the personal touch and values you bring to everything you do, and for taking the time to join us here in New Ottawa. And one last note, in addition to the other things Daniel mentioned, Terry was also founder of the one of the co-founders of the design school at Stanford, which has very much influenced our Center for Entrepreneurship and Engineering Design here, the SEED group, as well as our creation of this program in digital transformation and innovation. Anyways, you didn't come here to hear Daniel or me speak. Thank you very much for being here, Terry. Looking forward to hearing to what you have to say. Thank you for everything over the years.
Thank you for that very gracious introduction. I enjoyed having you as a student, and I've enjoyed the connections to Chanarong. So, and I'm happy to speak to our more intelligent neighbors to the north.
One more to everyone for just a bookkeeping. Professor Terry would like me to be the one that monitor your question in the chat. So the way the format of his lecture is you can ask question and at any time. And people who don't want to ask verbally, you can type your chat and then I will find a way to ask your question today. So you do your question do not need to wait until the end. It's more like conversation. That's what Professor Terry prefer. Yes. So now I'm handing to Professor Terry.
One more thing, Chanarong, before you
Yes.
hand off.
Yes.
Because I came in as a guest and you had to manually turn on my microphone and video, I can't turn them off. So perhaps if you could turn off my microphone.
Yes. Okay, I did it. I did it. Thank you. Now it's the time to Professor Terry. Thank you.
Alrighty. Well, at this point in my career, I tend to come in as the sort of elder voice, right? Wisdom from the years of experience. So hopefully you won't think I'm so old that I'm not with it anymore. But I want to start with a kind of review of, as I like to say, a half a century of being in artificial intelligence. So I'm going to talk about some of my early experiences and then the shift with Fernando Flores, as Liam mentioned, and then tie that into the current AI wave, which is very different from what it was when I was actively engaged in AI back in the middle of the last century. So, as you all probably know, artificial intelligence got its start in the 1950s, although there were people who had done things that were really in that direction before. But there was a conference at Dartmouth, and Marvin Minsky and John McCarthy and Newell and Simon and others were there. And it sort of is the launch of here is the thing called artificial intelligence that we're all doing. And from that, for the next 20 or 30 years, there was a kind of way that people thought about doing artificial intelligence. There were all sorts of differences and all sorts of theories and opinions, but the basic idea was that intelligence was what it was we were aware of when we were conscious about thinking, reasoning, representing, logic, all that kind of stuff. And therefore, if you wanted the model of the mind in the computer, we had to model those things. So it was explicit, representational. If the computer knew that the sky was blue, there was somewhere in there something saying sky is blue in some form or another. Now, at the beginning, I was there at MIT for a few years. That's where I did my dissertation. And then I came west to the Stanford AI Lab. John McCarthy was the director, and also consulting with the group at Xerox PARC, which is legendary. I mean, I'm sure many of you have heard of Xerox PARC. They created the laser printer, the graphical terminal, all sorts of things which are just today's computing world. And what I always say is I was there, but I wasn't working on that stuff. I was working on a group that was trying to do language understanding. And what happened is that in the course of trying to get computers to understand language like people, which my original dissertation was a kind of first stab at, I became more and more aware of the limitations of the way we were doing AI, of creating representations and doing algorithms that ran on those. And I got engaged with a broader group of influences. One of my students at Stanford, David Levy, was involved in a student discussion group with a bunch of students from Berkeley. And so I started meeting with them. I went to Berkeley and met with various faculty members like John Searle, Hubert Dreyfus. And at more or less that same time, I connected up with Fernando Flores. And as Liam pointed to, he has a very fascinating story, but I could take up the whole session talking about him. So we entered into some discussion and ended up publishing the book, Understanding Computers and Cognition. It was not a finished, here's the answer to everything. It was much more an exploration, not a coherent project, but sort of a moment in our ongoing exploration. So I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about the themes that showed up there and which have consequence for the way we think of AI today. It was based on thinking that you have to have a philosophical grounding for what you do in computing. You can't just be what do you say? I'm an engineer myself. I don't want to cast aspersions, but just an engineering view. You need a more underlying principled view. And in looking into the philosophy for that, the implicit philosophy that was, excuse me, underlying the work that had been done in AI and that I had been doing was analytic philosophy, the kind of thing that was developed in Germany, explored in England. I mean, there's a lot of, it was the dominant mode in philosophy of language in particular. And we got acquainted with phenomenology, which is hard to pin down as to exactly what it is, but it was a whole school of philosophy which questioned the primacy of the kind of logical representational thought that we are conscious of doing. So Heidegger, who was a German philosopher, had explored a lot of this in themes. I don't read German, and I never actually, never read Heidegger in the original and only read some of his works, but I was exposed to it through a philosopher at Berkeley, Hubert Dreyfus, who was really the person who brought that whole school of philosophy to the Western, the American technical world. And so I owe a lot to him for using his interpretations of that. So the first aspect is a distinction between what phenomenologists called thrownness and present at hand. So present at hand is something which, again, you can talk about, you can think about, you can represent. Thrownness is that you are acting at every moment in a world that is extremely complicated. It's got all sorts of different media, different messages. I mean different modalities. And that when you do things that are intelligent, you are not just doing them by present at hand thinking. Some of you have probably read work by Kahneman and Tversky. Tversky was here at Stanford actually when I came. And Kahneman got the Nobel Prize. Unfortunately, Tversky died young and couldn't get it. But Kahneman describes it as thinking is involved with multiple systems. He calls system one and system two, not very revealing names. But basically, one is the kind I was talking about, the kind that if I say, what were you thinking? You will tell me I was thinking that if I did this, then it would do that, and so on. The other is what we do without stopping to think about it. It's faster, it's less rationalized, and it's how we get by every day doing most of what we do, and reverting to system one when we need to sort of pause or there's a breakdown, to use the uh, Heideggerian term. Um, and then we think about what we're doing. So every going into AI and saying, instead of saying that every person has a knowledge base, knowledge being, of course, a word about this articulated representation, they have what we call a horizon. It's everything that you've always ever experienced and it's gone on with you and your physical body, and all of that is part of who you are and how you react. There's a big difference between what you might articulate as an explicit goal structure and what you're actually being driven by. And psychotherapy is based on that insight that you have to understand not what people say they think or think they think, but what is going on underneath. So what that leads to is the recognition that what we think is an overlay on what is guiding our in the world. And it was misguided to think we could reproduce human intelligence and human thought by framing it as problem solving, to use Newell and Simon's phrase, uh, in articulated reason. Now, again, I have to step back here historically and say, today, everybody sort of says, well, yeah, of course, very few of these models that are taking the world by storm actually try to articulate things. They just have lots of statistics and networks and some kind of magic that goes on in 2 trillion parameters, whatever that means. So current AI has made a drastic shift away from this explicit representation, but for the moment, still talking about what John Hoagland called GoFi, good old-fashioned AI. That's what dominated the notion of artificial intelligence pretty much to the end of the last century. So that leads to a question about what does it mean to be physically embodied? One of the answers you see when people say, well, can machines be intelligent? They'll say, well, it can't be intelligent until it has a human body. Now, it's not clear what that means. If it's a robot and it can walk and pick things up and so on, is that the same as having a human body? It's not in many ways. But there's really a sense, again, that what you do as a human, intelligent human, is tied into your physical embodiment and human communication. That things you hear about, I mean, where they're in the common knowledge, like implicit and explicit cues, like body pose, movement, facial expressions. Those are all a big part of how we interact with other people that are not there if you just have a cartoon face, although people are working on that, right? So there's been a long history, and I'm going to actually skip over some of the more philosophical literature here on how much of our cognition is physically embodied and directed by that versus the Cartesian, I think, therefore I am, right? Who you are, what you're doing is this cognition as a conscious thought. In the work I did with Flores, we tied this into the theories of a biologist named Umberto Maturana, who pointed to the ways in which behaviors that we think of as cognitive and we impute to conscious intentionality can be driven through what he calls a process of structural coupling, which is a physical process. And if I can be glad to answer questions on that. It's a complicated shift of understanding of how you look at cognitive systems. The other basis for our work in the work with Flores was the notion of commitment. And this came to some extent out of theory of speech acts, John Austin originally, and then John Searle, who developed it, who we worked with at Berkeley. And what it said is that you can't think of the meaning of something as being grounded in is it true or false. So if I say this, I'm sitting here in front of you, that's true. But if I say I'll be here tomorrow, is that true or is it false? It's the wrong dimension, right? I mean, it's not a question of a true or false. It's a question of my commitment. Do you believe that I'm committed to that? And what we explored, and I'll let you find it in more detail in the book, but is the ways in which the mechanics of language are really very much based on commitment rather than some notion of truth values. Okay, that even things that seem like statements, like, I'm going to Chicago next week, that's not true or false, right? And you have to look at who am I and what am I doing and what do I mean by saying it? And that's important in meaning. Now, we shift to the current. So what happened is, even back in the 50s, there were neural network models. McCulloch and Pitts at MIT started them back in the 40s, actually, and they were getting a bit more complex. And at that time, in fact, my advisors, Papert and Minsky, wrote a book called Perceptrons saying, oh, those are never going to work. So, and that was, you have to look at it in the larger context. That was basically written for funders of AI who had to decide who to give the money to. That's the way science works, for good or better or for worse. But their proof was based on a particular simple version of neural networks. That was the only thing that was feasible to implement at that time. What happened in the intervening decades is computers got way, way more powerful. I mean, multiple orders of magnitude more powerful. As you know, I mean, the phone you carry has way more computing than the massive research computer I worked on at MIT. It's just that Moore's law expanded. And that because the machine learning model, let me use that name, depends on lots of data, at the same time there was way more computing, there was also an incredible treasure trove of data on the internet. Everything that anybody had ever written was getting put there, anything that they were talking to their friends about, their email. I mean, there are just literally trillions of words on the internet. And if you take the basic functioning of a neural net and then you scale up the amount of data and the amount of processing by, as again, I say, multiple orders of magnitude, all of a sudden it can do things that, I mean, when I first saw ChatGPT and some of these modern AI things, my reaction was, oh no, they're faking. That can't be true. It can't do that. They weren't, I mean, some of them are faking. That's another question. But it really was able to do things which I would have said a few years ago, you can't get a computer to do that. And what I meant, which was true, is you can't get a computer to do that using the methodology that I remember from AI. That is still true. But it turns out that these systems, which, to use Emily, the linguist name, a stochastic parrot, all it's doing is finding things in this huge treasure trove of data that are close to what you're doing and projecting from there. Okay, so now, where is that going to take us? What does it do? And as you know, I'm sure there are hugely different opinions of this. So Jeff Hinton, who's often called the godfather of AI and he got the Nobel Prize, said, I am worried that the overall consequence of this might be systems more intelligent than us that eventually take control. Now, it's interesting for me to read that because back in the 1960s, my advisor Marvin Minsky had a slogan he loved to poke people with, trolling as we call it now, which was, well, in another 5 years, computers will be smarter than we are. And if we're lucky, they'll keep us as pets. So that now he was a little off in his timing since it was in the 1960s. But that basic fear is that if we're really making them be intelligent like humans, we know that humans can do things like try to grab power and take over. So why wouldn't a computer if it's thinking like a human? And you often see anecdotes where they've sort of set up a little scenario to make it look like that's what's happening. I think they're still anecdotes, but that's another question. Yuval Noah Harari, many of you have read his books on Sapiens and on the modern technology, basically. He said, there is no particular reason to believe that AI will develop consciousness as it becomes more intelligent. We should instead fear AI because it will probably always obey its human masters and never rebel. AI is a tool and a weapon unlike any other thing that human beings have developed, it will almost certainly allow the already powerful to consolidate their power further. So the question, and this is where I'm on his side of that debate, I don't really think that we have to worry about Skynet, the computer taking over. Sorry, Dave, I can't do that. But we do have to worry that it gives tremendous amount of power to people who know how to use it well, create false information, to influence people, to understand their, to catalog their interests and use that against them, and so on. So I think that what we need to do is recognize that it's the use of the technology, not the inherent nature of the technology, that's really the danger. Um, I like to quote, some of you may have read books by Joseph Weizenbaum. He wrote one book called Computer Power and Human Reason. And that's again was way back in the old days. But he made the argument that human judgment, that computers are very powerful for doing certain kinds of calculations, but that doesn't mean they have human judgment. Now, let me just go back to one thing here that Liam mentioned earlier, which is the schema challenge, which I did not have any role in inventing. Well, I did have a role, which is in my work on language, I gave examples in my dissertation of things that would be hard for a computer to do. So the example that I used is if you see the sentence, the city council refused a permit to the demonstrators because they feared violence, or the city council refused the permit to the demonstrators because they advocated violence. How do you know who they is? And the answer is, for a human, of course, it's pretty obvious, right? The city council is going to fear violence, and the demonstrators are more likely to advocate violence. But there's no simple logic that gives you that answer. Right? You're based on your human knowledge of what city councils do and so on. So unless you could really do that kind of reasoning, you couldn't. The example I gave was you couldn't translate it with the right gender for the they, because there are two different genders for the two theys, right? And so what Hector did is he said, yes, that is a general phenomenon. It's not just one example, that there are things which, if you can have a sentence which to either translate it or understand the connections, like the pronouns, you need that kind of deep knowledge. And if we can use those as a test, it's way better than the traditional Turing test. Again, I'm sure you all know about Alan Turing, who was really the founder of a lot of computer science and AI and so on. And his test was a fooling people test, right? If you can fool an interlocutor into thinking that they're talking to a human or typing to a human, then it, quote, is intelligent. Now, it's a very surface test. It doesn't say what it means to be intelligent, except that you act in a way which other people can't detect as non-intelligent. So Hector said this is a deeper problem because it draws on the problem with the Turing test. They had something called the Loebner Prize that was for many years a contest to see which programs had come closest to the Turing test. And the ones that always won were the ones who ignored what the other person said and made good jokes. They said, oh, that's pretty human. It makes good jokes. And of course, it had those stored, right? It didn't invent them. So I think that the question of when it's intelligence is not something to be answered by a simple measure of can it do 90% of this particular test. On the other hand, I just read this article in The Atlantic last month and by Mateo Wong, and he says, and I quote here because I wouldn't imagine this unless I quoted it. The information, which is the name of the article or the paper, reported late last year that Microsoft and OpenAI have come to an agreement defining artificial general intelligence as software capable of generating roughly $100 billion in profits. I look at it and say, wait a minute, what kind of definition is that? Right? It's saying if it can do well enough that it makes a lot of money from people, then it must be intelligent. And of course, at the heart of it, there is no real definition of what is intelligent. I mean, we all the time say about people we know or run into, oh, he's not very intelligent or he is intelligent. We have intelligent refrigerators and intelligent cars and excuse me. Um, it's just there is not a sort of simple boundary that says up to here you're not intelligent. So you get to 120 score, you are intelligent. Because there are different dimensions. And the dimension that we're dealing with here is that AI, as it's being done today, is not based on an intrinsic understanding or representation of values. So, one of my favorite quotes by John Hoagland is he said, "The problem with computers is that they don't give a damn." And that's exactly what the case is. If you say this computer is lying to me, this AI program is lying, what does it mean to lie? If you say it's giving me information which is false, sure, it's giving you information false. Is it lying? Or is it just that happens to have false information that comes up and it gives it to you? If you say this information wants to do so and so, this computer wants to do so and so, you can see symptoms because it's doing this, this, and this, which would indicate if it were a person that that's what they wanted to do. But there's nothing inside that's wants. That whole anthropomorphization of human intentions and motives and feeling stuff is being copied on the surface by this tremendously powerful ability to parrot and to parrot from huge numbers of sources. But in the end, the computer doesn't care, doesn't give a damn. And the question is, how do we approach that given that it's being used in so many contexts, in so many ways? Now, as Leah mentioned, I was involved in the creation of something called the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. This is back in the 80s when the big issue that everybody was worrying about was the drive towards real nuclear war. Reagan was rattling sabers. And at that time, there were a lot of groups called Something for Social Responsibility. And one of our slogans was, technology is driving the future. It's up to us to do the steering. And that's basically the issue here. Technology will do all sorts of amazing things, and it will lead to changes economically, it will lead to changes politically, but somebody human and based on human social interaction and responses has to be making the decisions about will it be used for this or that. And what we see now is a lot of press from the people who are making money off of it to say, oh, it should do everything. Don't worry. Now, I'm in between. I'm not a doomer, as they say, who says there's going to be a cataclysm and then we're all going to be pets of the AI if it wants to keep us. But I'm also not a rosy, what's the right word, optimist who says, oh, don't worry. We do need to worry. And again, the example which we have is social media. If you looked at social media 30 years ago, people would say, oh, this is going to be great. I can keep in touch with my family. I can make friends. I can have good discussions about politics. I can share recipes. La, 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 la. And that was all there, but nobody said it's going to lead to, and then the list of ails that have come from people's social media practices, from trolling and terrible, not good discussion, but terrible discussion, to depression, to addiction. And that's all because of the way that it got implemented, right? I mean, when the motivation for how you do the social media is to get more eyeballs on more pages with more ads, you go in a different direction than if the motivation is to give them a sense of community. It's just a different thing. And of course, as with many technologies, the ones who do the steering are the ones who make the money from it because they have the power to direct it. So how do we deal with that? There's a humor magazine that I subscribe to, and they have a T-shirt with the slogan, "Someone should do something." And that's the problem, right? I mean, who is the someone, and what can they actually do to bring AI systems into better alignment with the kinds of personal and social values that we want to hold accountable to? And we can't count on the companies to do that because their very nature, they're profit-seeking organizations. They're going to put market demands ahead of these ideas of broader social good. And that was even before the current right-wing fight against, what's it called? Social and economic, whatever. The acronym that means you're worried about what you do to the world, not just how much profit you make. Um, so you say, well, maybe the people who, the decision about how AI gets used should be done by governments. And again, I think as Canadians, you have a little more trust in your government than we currently do in ours. But I mean, look at what's happening, say, in China as an example. I mean, they have a government which has values, and they're very value driven, but they're different values. They're not independence and social autonomy. They are harmony and social unity. And given those values, they build them into the system. So a government, by nature of not looking for profits, may not build the right things in either. Um, so if you look around the world, there are lots of places in which people are trying to develop some kind of control over where AI is going to go and how it's going to be used. Europe has always been high, when you say high on the end of regulators, the EU is big on regulation. So there's the European regulation. In this country, it is a little hard. I mean, what you get this cacophony. You get big AI executives saying, yes, yes, we need you to regulate us. And what they mean is we need you to pass laws such that if things don't go the right way, we're not responsible. You get out of liability, right? So you can't trust just the surface of, oh, yes, regulate or don't. And then, of course, if you're following current American politics, the big bill, I won't call it beautiful, but the current economic bill that's going through Senate now actually has a clause in it which says individual states are not allowed to regulate AI for 10 years. Why not? Because they don't trust states like California to follow the rules they would want to follow. And that may not go through. I think it's probably going to get blocked in the Senate. But nevertheless, it's a complicated question of if you knew how to regulate it, which I don't think anybody does yet. We're working on that. There are institutes that put out white papers all the time on how might you regulate these things. There's the internet doesn't sit in one place, right? I mean, there's so many venues and so many jurisdictions, even within a country, state and local and all that. That's very hard to imagine effective regulation. Even as I say, even if you knew what would be effective, which is hard. I just saw a thing in today's paper or yesterday's about regulation against software that can take a picture of anyone and make them nude. So you get what's called non-consensual porn, right? You get pictures of, if you look at it, it looks like this person, but it's in fact generated. And there are laws against putting up pictures, non-consensual pictures. But if these are not real pictures, they're AI generated, how do you regulate them? And I read some of the companies that do it have said, we're not going to do it anymore. That's okay. And that's because they want to avoid liability, of course. But another company said, no, this is free speech. Who determines those values? At what level of governmental or social structure do you determine those kinds of values? And I think that is just a huge, I mean, today's climate is in this country, to be clear, is against regulation of anything. So it's unlikely we're going to get effective regulation. Self-regulation runs into all the problems that I said, which is the people who are doing it have other motives. They want to look good. They don't want to be told they're doing a bad thing, but on the other hand, if something is going to maximize their profit, that's what they'd rather do. So I'll read from my prepared remark, which is, I would love to be able to complete this discussion with a clear vision of a better future and a stirring call to arms telling you where to go tomorrow to storm the barricades. You know the next word has to be but. Right? But we're not in that kind of world. And I use a metaphor from, again, borrowed from Fernando Flores, who I wrote with and worked with. The question is, going back to the slogan of who's steering, how do we actually steer into the future? And the model of navigation, which comes from ocean navigation, is pretty much, you know where you want to get, you look at the stars and the moon or whatever, you know what direction you're going, and you head that way. And he says, no, that's not like that. It's like going down a whitewater river in a raft. At any given moment, you don't know for sure where you're going to go next, but you have to direct it. You have to paddle, you have to steer. And that what we need to do is to create the kinds of social networking institutions and political institutions that are capable of seeing where that next rock is ahead and putting concerted effort, not just one person's effort, into steering away from it, knowing that once we do, that doesn't solve the question. It just gives us another chance to go further. And I think that's the challenge that we have with artificial intelligence. How do we become navigators down this rushing stream in a way that lets us anticipate, not wait till after we've crashed on a rock, anticipate and avert away from the kinds of social problems which is going to cause, no question. And I was talking to somebody about regulation. I've not forgotten who it was, somebody who knows a lot about government regulation. And he said, well, nobody's going to regulate until there's a catastrophe. There's no political will to regulate something because people say, wait a minute, it could be bad. That precautionary principle is not, certainly, again, American politics. So now the question is, do we just have to wait for a catastrophe to happen and then work from there? Or is there some way to try to anticipate and avoid catastrophes? I mean, somebody else, and these discussions come up all the time, not in technical work. Is trust dead? Interesting question to ponder, right? Given the ability to produce fake apparent facts about anything, visual, written, whatever, are we going to be in a society where people can't really say anything is true? And if so, what is that going to do to our social fabric? So, as I say, I think we have to fight each bend as we come to it, but I don't think there's a simple answer to where that's going to go. So I did talk straight through, but let's go to questions.
So now we'll come to your questions. Alden, what is your question? Please go ahead.
Uh, Hi everyone. So my question to the Prof. Terry, I feel like from this talk, like governments often lack the expertise or even trust from the public to regulate AI, and the giant tech companies either resist the actual regulation, or they really want the regulation that you mentioned to just have their way with the tools that they are producing. So in the current like era, it feels like we are in a race to build like an AI equivalent of something like a nuclear technology. And once that happened, then it becomes nearly impossible to reverse that. Do you think we are heading towards that tipping point?
I wish I had the knowledge of the future. We could be. I don't dismiss that as, oh, that's just being too worried. And especially because it gets tangled up. I mean, I didn't mention this, but you've all read about it, I'm sure, that it gets tangled up in this international posturing. The Chinese have to be better than we are, and we have to be better than the Chinese. And if people say, let's
Yes.
try and think about where this is going and slow it down or direct it in the good way, they say, oh no, they're gonna do it anyway. They're gonna go first. And I mean, let me give my moment of pessimism, which is the human ability to think and interact with people developed over millions of years in small tribes. And the ability to manage human relationships in a world where everybody is connected to everybody else instantly is really hard. And the pathologies of that may get to us. I'm not sanguine to say, oh no, we'll figure out how to get around that. But it is a problem.
Thank you.
So next question is from the chat, Ben, and then after that, Muhammad. Ben have a question on the chat. Said, if we represent good enough of the real world in data, does it eventually become indistinguishable from real world understanding? Could a model eventually achieve a level of understanding indistinguishable from our own? ChatGPT can converse better than many humans?
Well, so that goes back to the question I was saying about Turing tests and those kinds of things. That is, could in many different areas of communication, I'm trying to write a memo, you're trying to write a book, somebody else is trying to respond to their friend. Could in those cases the AI system come up with a piece of text that we think is better than what the person could have come up with, better for whatever purposes it is? I don't deny that. I mean, I think that's what's happening. You see that all over. When I look at the people who say I'm using AI, tremendous variety of things they're doing with it. And if you say, is it perfect? I say no, but it's good enough, especially if they then use it as a start for editing, as opposed to just taking it as given. But you go on an online help system to get help about something that's broken. They'll probably do as good a job as that person sitting in a call center would. Um, so certainly that's going to happen. Now, if you say yes, and therefore are they intelligent? I say no, they don't give a damn. Right? This help system has no sense of me or who I am. I once had a friend who was talking, this is back in the old days, about artificial intelligence, and he said the prime example of artificial intelligence is a computer program that makes a really great chess move while sitting in a room that's burning. And that's it. I mean, the great chess move is the kind of logic that the AI systems can do. They don't have the context to say, oh, I'm going to get burned here, right? That's not part of their world. Their world is just the set of texts they have or
Okay.
pictures. We have to say it's not just text.
Next question from Muhammad.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Professor, for your time. We really appreciate you sharing your experience and insights with us. I have two questions. Question one is that I feel we're in a race that is happening right now, and the concept is us versus them, where us is OpenAI, Microsoft, Google Gemini, and them is DeepSeek, and so on. So as curious students, where should we stand in this equation? This is my first question, and I'll have another question.
All right, so let me generalize out on that a little bit because it's a whole area that we talked about a lot in Computer Professionals Group. What is the role of the technologist or technology student in these big social questions? You're never going to be, not never, but it's highly unlikely that you're going to be in a situation where you can say, look, company, you have to stop doing this, and it will. You can protest just like people, citizens anywhere, but you're a citizen. You're not a leader in general. And I think what kind of responsibility? I don't feel it's fair. I had a colleague back again in those days who said, well, you may think I have this moral fiber of a styrofoam cup, but I believe, and then he went on to basically give the standard, if I don't do it, somebody else will. I don't accept that, right? You can't just throw up all thing. On the other hand, the question is, how does the power that you have, whatever position you're in, make the possibility of a difference greater? So we do see examples of employees of companies like, especially Google over time, going out and demonstrating against their company. We don't want to do, whether it was censorship in China or aerial photography for military and so on. It has a small effect. I mean, I wouldn't say that they turned the ship and that Google went in a different direction, but that's true of politics in general. What I'm doing today in electoral politics isn't going to push Trump out of office, but it can be part of a larger thing. And so the ultimate discussion about social responsibility is it's a group process. It's not I'm going to be the one who makes this happen. It's going to be how do I form coalitions and work together with other like-minded people who want to shift it.
Your second question, Muhammad?
Yeah, thank you. The second question, we see that current students, to be more specific, high school students, have more knowledge of this whole AI technology and the usage and so on. But on the other hand, educators are kind of behind in this. How can we fill this gap? Is this gap fillable, or what can we do?
I mean, I'll give the flippant answer. Well, wait, they'll die and somebody else will do it. But let me not say that. Um, it's especially an issue at this point with educators down the chain. I'm not talking about college professors. There are college professors who don't know what's going on in AI, but I think the better ones, will learn and develop their knowledge and so on. And but I was just on a Zoom a couple of days ago. A friend of mine is um, doing on parents and kids and teachers. So, how does a teacher of a fifth grader or a third grader deal with the fact that the kids are using AI? If you say, bring back a paper tomorrow talking about Galapagos, now it used to be they just copied out of the encyclopedia, right? But even if you get fancy and you say, well, but think about what it would mean for so and so to go there and do this and such, Chat GPT will do that for them. So if you stick your head in the sand and you say, let's forbid it, don't let him, and we'll build detectors, it'll find when they're doing it, that's an arms race that you're not going to win. I mean, you're never going to be able to detect it reliably, and you get false positives and all the kind of problems. If you say, okay, so that part of the job could be done by the computer, what is the part that the person needs to do in addition to that? How do they bring context, background, insight, values, and all those things into this? And reflect it not by handing you a piece of text, which is what the AIs do very well, but getting into a back and forth discussion and so on. Then I think, and so their whole project is how do you make, given that kids are going to use AI, how do they use it well? And well here doesn't mean productivity. Well here means encouraging their own independent thinking.
Okay, next
Thank
question
you.
from the chat, from Eva, and then back to Patricia in person. So Eva question is, how will AI impact teaching and learning in higher educations?
So I mean, it's a little more sophisticated, but the same thing that I think are measures of education. I mean, to use a metaphor that goes way back, I mean, an educated person should be able to do arithmetic, right? They should be able to multiply numbers, divide long division. The answer is why? Because they can use a calculator. That's not the essence of the intelligence. And I think right now we're still embedded, not in that one, but there's a knowledge premium. It says, okay, the best student is the one who knows the most facts. And the answer is, they can get the facts anytime they need. That was true with Wikipedia even before AI, but certainly in AI, they can get the particular ones that are aimed at what they're looking at and so on. What is it that we're trying to educate them to do in terms of creativity and independent thinking? That is not the matter of knowing, Battle of Hastings was in 1066. I mean, they can look that up, right? How do you focus on the context? And this is for things like history and humanities, focus on the human context of what it is rather than the details which you can look up. That's going to require rethinking the curriculum. It's going to require rethinking the assignments because, as I say, most assignments can be met pretty well by a thing that puts out plausible text. So that's no longer a good measure of whether the student is learning. So I think it's going to be a big shift and more in some disciplines than others. But they still, you get computers that can solve mathematical problems. And the thing you want to educate students for is not, how quickly can they find the right computer program to do that, but how would they do it if they came up with something different and something. You get a lot of these examples. I mean, everybody's familiar with the so-called hallucinations that computers come up with facts and citations and all sorts of stuff that aren't real. But you also get blind spots. So a lot of you know the crossing the river problem with you have a man and a goat and was it wheat and goat and fox, and you have to be able, you only put two in the boat and you have to get them across and back and so on and so on. And they got a lot of great AI results because, of course, that has been talked about so often by so many people that coming back with what was in those results is good. And they said, okay, here's another problem. What if you have a man and he has, the wheat and the fox, and the boat can hold three things. The answer is, well, he puts all three in and he goes, right? I mean, that's pretty straightforward. But because that's not something which was talked about in all of this huge amount of literature about it, the computer had no idea, right? Because it doesn't really have ideas anyway. I avoid that talk. But so as soon as you move outside of the historically predictable, which I'll use that word, um, it's not there. How do you get people to fill that in? How do you make that the skill that we really train for?
Thank you. Next question from Patricia.
Yes, thank you. First of all, just thank you to Professor Terry and also to you, Shanaran. This is the second time that I'm privileged to listen to your lecture. So thanks again for inviting us. So actually, my question was kind of stolen by Mohammed. Thank you, Mohammed. But I wanted to just comment on that as well. I had the same kind of question. What can we do, right? As students in these masters, as professionals in engineering and trying to do our part, and especially with so much pressure from society, and as we face it with social media to participate and to kind of get on board with this AI in this AI wagon and to get our companies and to kind of really get caught up with what's happening. What can we do to really slow down and to make sure that this is done correctly? And then I think you get a great answer about it. But I guess I work in aviation and I just wanted to comment. I think you're absolutely right. Perhaps something very awful is going to have to happen before we do something about it, because that's often what happens in aviation. An accident, a fatality has to occur before someone says, "Oh, wait a second, maybe we should take action and put some procedures in place." Hopefully, this is not the case for AI, but I guess we'll have to wait and see. And so my second question was in regards to, we often talk about in the lectures that we have in some of the classes here and back in at my company, about how models are being trained right now, and how we have these loops where the models are now training themselves, right? With our inputs, and now they're able to just train themselves, and how this is good at certain extent, right? Like the loop at certain point needs external input. And like, but my question is like, is bias and social and responsible AI even possible? Given that at the end of the day, there's gotta be some input from us, right? And how can we even be sure that bias is not there? How can we be sure that responsible AI is achievable when we know that at the end of the day, like you said, we are the ones who are doing the steering, good or bad. We're the ones who are gonna be giving that information to the machines, right? In your opinion, is this how achievable this non-bias and really responsible AI is possible?
So let me focus on you said bias several times, and let me give a philosophical warning and then go on. So everybody's biased. And I think trying to say we want unbiased people is just like saying we want non-human people. Now, if you know your biases and you compensate for them, you can do things which are not driven by that bias. And I think, I mean, of course, I mean, pick the most obvious one in this country, and probably there to some extent too, which is racial bias. If you say to lots of people, "Are you biased?" they would say, "Oh, no, not at all." But you show them a bunch of pictures and they react to them and so on, and it's clear they're thinking number one or two, whichever one it is, that isn't what they say to themselves. They're very biased. So how do you deal with that? You don't say, well, we're going to get rid of bias. I think you can try to decrease it, for example, by having, I mean, there are all these examples of training sets for visual faces, which work better on people who are a certain race and not better on others and so on. That's okay. Let's change the training set and see if we can fix that. That's not a hard problem. The hard problem is that no matter how you train it, the mass of data you're putting in, it has a bias. It comes from somebody. It comes from somewhere. And especially in this world, language bias, right? That is, most of the stuff that's being done is in English or Chinese, right? But and if you say, well, is that going to be biased relative to somebody who speaks, I mean, even French, but Wolo or whatever it is, of course it will be because they don't have the background of materials there. Now, again, in the long run, that can probably be dealt with to some extent by adding more and more and more outside of the circle that you're talking about. But the question is, how do we accept that they will have certain biases and monitor? Again, back to the river metaphor, monitor where they're headed and deal with them when they happen, as opposed to saying, well, we'll just find a way to not have bias.
Thank you. Next question from online, Kilash.
Yeah, I have a question from Henry. I have questioned that the European Union has implemented an AI compliance law, while the United States has not established any formal AI compliance regulations. Canada approach trained to align closely with that of the US, depending on its developments.
Okay, I'm not sure I got that right. You're talking about a complaint
The compliance is law.
for AI.
The compliance is rule and regulations. The European Union has implemented the compliance law and regulation for AI, but the US is still not implemented. So Canada is just depend on the US to implement the AI law.
Yeah, no, I think again, I said that very broadly before. This is not a world where everybody sets their own rules and lives within them. The rules that are set by people all over the world and different governments and so on affect people everywhere else as well. And I think, I mean, this is hardly a unique problem to AI. I mean, let's take climate, right? I mean, the world is facing collectively this huge climate crisis, and various people in various places are doing things about it. And other places, unfortunately now the US, are saying, oh, well, don't worry, not our problem. How can you, and what they do to the climate affects everybody. It's not like you can say, okay, you have your climate, we have our climate, right? So now you're asking for socio-political wisdom, which I have less of. I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question from Hamad. Hamad from online. Ahmed?
Sorry, me?
Yes.
Okay. Let me continue, Professor Terry, for this point. Like, who will regulate the AI? As you said, it's like a climate. Like, you cannot just regulate in your country, and because you're going to affect all other countries. So I think most of the people now aware about the future of the AI and still asking who will regulate. You just say that maybe the government should start with this, but again, which government? So we need somebody to hang the bill. We need somebody to start, maybe some organization or social or I'm not sure. I don't want to be not sure because we have to start regulate the internet. Sorry, the AI. Because it's time to do right now. After that, maybe it's too late. So is it possible to have something started by the UN, for example, and the universities? Universities maybe I would say more transparent than the governments. The government sometimes there is a lot of corruption. There's a lot of political issues. So I my call is we need to start doing something, maybe by the no, not the government, maybe the UN and the universities, and then again uh, coming or reaching out maybe the companies and the AI itself. He must be like one of our partners in regulating the AI itself.
That's a good goal. I mean, I think UN is an interesting question because in some parts of the world, and especially here, it's considered, pure bureaucracy, no value. And it has to overcome that prejudice in order to do anything. So you get UN regulations of all sorts of stuff, which then the US doesn't sign on to. But it's not, I mean, so let me say it a little differently, which is I think there are many organizations. The UN is one, a lot of NGOs that are doing this, some universities, it's not uniform, some think tanks, there are think tanks, which are thinking about and trying to explore what kind of regulations are possible. And I think that's very valuable. I think that's what we need to be doing. I don't think any of them have the power to implement them. And that's the problem. I mean, you can write a wonderful white paper on why this or that should be done, but unless you have influence that can actually control what people do on the internet, which is hard to do, right? It'll just be a white paper. But I think it's still very important to do that thinking because it will form the basis for what will develop in the political sphere.
Now, from now, I'm going to move back to the chat, two questions, and then move to the online in-person two questions. The next question from Songbin asks, many websites now use verification mechanism to identify whether a robot or a real person is visiting the website. I would like to ask, will this identification mechanism become ineffective in the next 5 years? And will it be impossible to effectively distinguish between machine and humans? Then how will technical verification be used to distinguish between machine and human?
So I think certainly the things that are used now, it's an arms race, right? People are going to come up with AI programs that can defeat those. Somebody else will come up with one that's better and so on. I think it's a doomed arms race in that it's it's not going to be easy. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Orb, it's called, which is a device being pushed by Sam Altman. I don't know if it's in OpenAI or another company, but it's Sam Altman, which looks at your iris and knows a pattern. It has recorded patterns of iris, and your iris is just as unique to you as your fingerprints, right? It's the same idea as fingerprints, except that you can just look into your screen and it can see your eye. And he has this whole scheme, which is sort of interesting because he's concerned with privacy. First thing everybody thinks about if you say this is, oh my God, everywhere I go, if you've seen Minority Report movie, there's something where somebody actually trades eyeballs so that he won't get picked up by his eye scan and so on, right? So it's a perfect way for an authoritarian government or agency to know for sure who you are and where you are. And what Sam has tried to do is say, here's how we'll do it with cryptography and with all sorts of complicated technology so that nobody, even though they can use it, they can trust it for authenticating you, they can't use it to find you, whatever the right word is. I don't know if that's true. It's a technological thing. But in the end, what they're saying, which I think is true, is you're never going to have a test unless you have flesh and blood.
Yeah. Yeah.
Squeeze my hand and it knows me. And I mean, even fingerprints, of course, there's no reason you can't fake a fingerprint. Eye scans are a little harder, but again, people will find ways around them.
Mm-hmm. Next question from the chat and from Anthony. The question is, what is your view on the availability of data to fuel future improvement in AI? Are we heading for a slowdown?
A lot of people have talked about this, eating its own dog food, whatever the right metaphor is, which is that there's a certain amount of information on the internet, and once you've got all of it, you've got all of it. Now, that's not quite true. And what you see now is a lot of applications and websites and so on, which clearly, when you look behind what they're doing something for you. They're helping you get cute dog pictures, whatever it is. What they're doing behind that is trying to gather up information about you and what you do. And that's new information every day because you have new people and they're doing new things. So it's not that there's a finite bounded amount. I mean, every time you have a text conversation with anybody or an email conversation, you're adding to the world of text that it can train on. Now you could argue that, well, Google shouldn't give them all your email, but I think Google does use email for training. I actually don't know that for a fact. But every day they're getting millions of more words to train on. So I don't think that there's this sort of imminent, resource thing we're going to run out. But it's going to take, first of all, more clever things. And second of all, I mean, as you also know, there's this huge debate about appropriate use of materials that are generated by creators. So is it fair for the AI image generators to feed into their training all of the images generated by all the artists they can find? Or does the artist say, no, that's my copyrighted image. You cannot use it for training. Not just you can't give it to somebody, right? That's easy. But you can't use it for training. And that's being negotiated in the courts. I mean, that's not a simple legal issue.
Next question from the in-person ARC, Krishnan.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor, for arranging this wonderful lecture. And I have a question to Professor Winograd. And I just saw your profile. You have wealth of experience on the context of computing. You just mentioned that the computer that you worked on was less powerful than the phones of today. Given this background, my question is on the intersection of quantum computing and AI. As we are in the cusp of quantum computing being reality, do we need to be worried or cautious on the capability of AI or AGI, those systems to self-correct, self-learn, generate more knowledge, or teach each other, right? One system teaching the other, instead of waiting for human beings to feed them with data. Is there or is it just kind of unfounded?
Let me separate out two parts of that question. The first part was specifically quantum computing. And I will do my standard disclaimer. I don't understand quantum physics. I don't understand how you would use qubits for computing. I believe that people are doing it. I mean, it's not totally fantasy. But when you try to predict how will that kind of computing change what you do with computing? The only example you get consistently is it will break cryptography and give you new means of cryptography. But that's not my field. I'm not an expert in that. So I don't think the question you asked about things like computers training each other is a question separate from whether they use quantum or not. And then the question is to go back some of the earlier questions I got about the data that's feeding all that. I mean, if it's all just feeding it around in circles, that's not very good. If each computer has its own independent collection of data, then of course feeding it across is increasing the data set. So it'll be done, but it's not the metaphor of me telling you something and now you know it is not the metaphor. I mean, it's a metaphor, but it doesn't follow through.
Next question from the chat before I go to Muhammad in-person ARC. This question from Professor Liam Payton. Perhaps perhaps the call to action needs to be more about people and less about technology. The promotion of human value, community judgment, authority that are currently relentlessly being undermined by the capitalism and technology.
Yep, I have to agree. I mean, if you ask what I'm spending my own time on now, it's not developing technology, and it's not even that much observing technology, although I do that like today. It's political. It's in dealing, how do you create a social system that works given where we're starting from and what the trends are? And I think it's social, political, working with other people. I mean, it's not inherently technological, but I think that's a critical thing to do.
Next question, Muhammad, your third question.
Yep, thank you. So we hear a lot this debate that they compare the technology with nuclear weapon, which I argue that because nobody has the power to kind of push a button and nuclear power or bomb drops somewhere. Where this AI is being used by individuals in different levels of society. The way I would put it is it's like knife. And knife, we can use it to peel a fruit or do something else with it. Where did we learn that in education? And that was my main point of my second question, where I feel the educators are not doing what is supposed to be done. And the result is what we're seeing. The future of workforce, I don't want to be pessimist, but it's questionable, it's arguable, and yeah, I don't know what we should do and what needs to be done in that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The educational systems, for better and for worse, are conservative in not in the political sense of conservative, but in the sense of changing versus staying steady. They're a kind of balancing force in a society which is running all over back and forth with technologies and so on to say, we still read the classics, right? We still think about these issues, these timeless issues and so on. And I think that's a valuable function at the same time as it can be pulled back from being able to see change and move with change. So I think changing the educational system is a big, hard problem. It's like changing any very large entrenched system. And I think we need to be able to say, and what people are doing is to say, okay, let me give a course online for faculty, for people who are going to be teaching, so they will become aware of these issues, not tell them what to do, but just make them more aware of all those. And I think that's a very important function. On the knife, I mean, again, I agree with that. I mean, nuclear weapons were a specific example, and I think they're often, it's like Nazism. It's a metaphor, but it's a bad metaphor for some things. And thing about a nuclear weapon is it's black or white, on or off. You blow it up and everything's gone, right? And that's not what's going to happen with AI. It's not going to blow everything up. It's going to erode and change and do all sorts of things. So in that sense, I think it's very different from a nuclear weapon, but all analogies have their flaws.
Our next question, I just remind you, we have 10 minutes left as going to be 1.5 hour that I was asking the time from Professor Terry. Next question from Iwa. What advice would you give to higher education researcher who want to elevate their university presence in the global AI landscape, not just through technical contributions, but through meaningful human-centered innovations?
It's a good question. I mean, the kind of research which deals with the social consequences is not the kind of research that gets rewarded in computer science journals and conferences and all that very much. I mean, it's really social research. It's not technology research. It's research about technology. And if you look at any school, their science and technology program is tiny, tiny compared to their actual technology development departments. So if you have a research group, then I think keeping these questions alive as you do things, raising what they're doing and having a section in your paper which says, here are the consequences that might come from this that we should be aware of, is very valuable. It's not going to get you, national prominence, international prominence for being the great researcher. I think that's going to go, if it does, and I hope it does, to people who are starting from a background of law and economics and all the other fields that control what we do, or not control, understand what we do in a social environment.
And the next question I would say that will be the last question to you. And I'm sorry for other question that didn't get asked. You can send your question to me. Maybe I can compile in the email to Professor Terry, and then I can coordinate on that. The last question is from Mama. How can we help the future generation build their critical thinking while growing up in the world where AI offer all responses?
That's a good question. I think it's a question I've sort of alluded to as we've gone along here, that we don't yet know how that is the goal. That is the thing we need to do. And there are all sorts of social political reasons as well as the use of AI that make that hard. And we have to understand that education is not about knowledge and facts and being fluent at putting out text, but it's about playing a role in a society, being a citizen, being a thoughtful, values-based person. And I think that has to be taught at a very different level. It's not a course, it's how you live and it's how you interact with other people.
Thank you so much, Professor Terry Winograd, for your amazing lecture. And I'm sure that my student in my class, my former student, and other participants from this lecture learn a lot from you. And I will come. The person who the question didn't get asked, just send it to me by email. I will put it to Professor Terry and then coordinate on that. And I hope everyone have a good learning experience tonight. I couldn't thank you for all your support to us, to me, to many people in here, and we hope you and your family are all the best and have a good summer.
Thank you. You too. To all of you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. For the student, back to the class. Bye. Nice to see you, Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you for arranging this.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you, Professor. Have a good evening, everyone.